Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I hope you've all settled in nice and comfy for our long excursion through the blueprints of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle. This is, I don't think anybody except for maybe a few architects' favorite portion of the Torah. Because in the building of the tabernacle, we hear the material list, we hear how big it was made and how the different implements were formed and shaped. And then having said it, we then repeat that everything got built according to that specification, so we kind of get a doubling up of the whole thing. This is going to dominate the readings for the next couple weeks. So like I said, I hope you're settling in. But it, of course, demands us that we must ask, why? Why were we being told in such exquisite detail how to build the Mishkan? Why build it in the first place would even come to mind. I mean, after all, we had not had a Mishkan. Abraham didn't have a tabernacle. Isaac, Jacob didn't have a tabernacle. Moses, when he was at the burning bush, didn't have a tabernacle. Our people in Egypt didn't have a tabernacle. Do we really need this? And do we need the headache of following all of these instructions in order to build it? Well, as is normal in our tradition, there are multiple answers, because one answer will just never do. So the first answer, of course, is that during all of those different generations, we were dealing with mostly individuals, or maybe the individual's family. So if Abraham was building an altar to sacrifice on behalf of his family, he could literally get everybody around the altar to participate in that, because everybody knew they lived in the same area. It was a spontaneous and easy to organize event. When you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of people, not so easy to organize things on the fly. You need a system, you need a structure, you need a agreed upon focal point of the community worship, which leads us to part two, which is that with that focal point, there needed to be a little bit of control. That, as we see from the stories surrounding the Israelites at this time, and even later throughout our history, we're not always good when left to our own devices. When we improvise in theology, it often ends up badly. We have a tendency to drift towards idolatry over and over again. We see that most clearly in very short order as we are bowing down to a golden cow. So having something that was very carefully spelled out. This is exactly how big it should be. No, it doesn't need to be any bigger. And no, you can't skimp and make it shorter. And this is exactly how many sacrifices you will be doing, and these are the people who will be officiating, and this is how many sacrifices. You don't have to go crazy. I don't need all the cows to be slaughtered, but you do need to have a system for it to happen on a regular basis. This was there to help guide us away from our extremes and away from our laziness or apathy. But with all of that in mind, some of the details still force us to ask deeper questions. In particular, there is a lovely detail in the Mishkan that is, the focal point, the building of the Aron HaKodesh, the literal Ark of the Covenant. Raiders of the Lost Ark fans can all show their joy, because if you remember from that movie, what was on top of that Ark?
Cherubim.
The cherubim, right? Not angels, type of angel, right? Cheruvim, or cherubs, as we put it into English. Now, when I say the word cherub, and we are still in the shadow of Valentine's Day, everybody is thinking of cute little fat babies with a heart, right? That's Cupid, by the way, not a cherub. Even within the Western canon, those are two different creatures, but we sort of ended up merging those two ideas together, and everybody misses the point, because a cherub, the cherub in the biblical text, is not a cute little baby. It is a ferocious monster. It is a guardian beast. Exactly what they look like is a subject of quite a lot of debate, and we're not going to go down that rabbit hole tonight. But suffice it to say, they had wings and they were fierce. After all, it was a cherub that was placed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden to keep humanity from regressing back into it, and it stood there with a flaming sword. Not exactly a symbol of sweetness. But just a few minutes ago, I said one of the motivations for building a Mishkan was to steer us away from idolatry. And in fact, in the Ten Commandments, we heard distinctly that we are not meant to make physical representations of things like, well, angels. And yet, here we are being given explicit instructions to make angels on the most holy point of the entire Mishkan, the entire tabernacle. Am I crazy? Did I read all this right? See, this is why you have to be paying attention, because one verse will affect how you understand another verse, and they may be chapters apart. So what do we do with this? Well, we've got a couple of different options. There is one answer from our tradition that says, well, you see, this wasn't a problem of idolatry. These cherubim were in the Holy of Holies, literally the Holy of Holies, which meant no one was ever going to see them. So there was no temptation that they were going to be worshipped, because they were hidden away from sight. Now, in my opinion, this explanation is not a very good one and shows a complete misunderstanding of human psychology. Because it turns out people are very good at worshiping things that they've never actually seen and making up pictures in their own mind of what they look like, and that someone could easily say, well, I saw when we carried it what it looked like, and I'm still going to remember that, and I think when I'm making a sacrifice, I am making a sacrifice for those angels, for those cherubs, and now we're down the path of idolatry, lickety-split. Probably not the best explanation to say, it's okay, they're hidden. Second explanation was that, well, this was what God had asked us to put on it. And therefore, we do what God asks. Plain and simple, don't ask any more questions than that. God gave us the instructions to put it on, therefore, we're going to put it on. I believe that answer is halfway there, right? If God had not told us to put the cherubs on top of the ark, absolutely, we would never have been allowed to put cherubs as our own decorative motif anywhere near any divine implement. And since God did say it, we can. But the question is still coming back to why. Well, there's an underlying imagery here that is trying to be conveyed within strict parameters. And this is where it's tricky to be human. Because as humans, we love to simplify things, and Judaism defies oversimplification. Judaism is about the details, the particulars, and the nuance. So, it is trying to say in this visual representation that here in the Holy of Holies, this is the place where we will feel closest to God's presence, which is infinite. But here we will feel that presence most acutely. And in fact, when we think of that spot, we will think of not just the fact that we are connecting to God, but that everything in the universe, whether it be human, animal, vegetable, mineral, or angelic, is subservient to God. And these angels, who are in a form of prostration, of bowing on top of this ark, are symbolic of the fact that even the heavenly host is subservient to God. Now, we could not have come up with that on our own because we're not allowed to make such representations. But God can tell us to put that on that, so we will have that idea. But more importantly, having done so, it is explaining one of the deeper truths of Judaism. There are exceptions. It's not so simple as just memorizing a list of rules and then saying, I know what to do. Because one rule may apparently contradict another. As our sages point out, we have a rule not to cause a wound on Shabbat. Right? That Shabbat is not a time when we should be engaged in any kind of fisticuffs and struggling. But if a child was born 8 days prior to Shabbat, and Shabbat is the day of Brit Milah for circumcision, guess what we do? We circumcise the child on Shabbat. It takes precedence over the normal prohibition on doing such things on the day of Shabbat. And likewise, we know that on Shabbat we don't make wounds, as I just mentioned. Well, what do we do in the tabernacle? The Kohanim will take the daily sacrifice and the Musaf sacrifice, the animals that are being brought for sacrifice on Shabbat, and they're going to be slaughtered on Shabbat. It takes precedence over the normal prohibitions. If you are making a talit, and you want to attach tzitzit, and the only materials you have available are linen and wool, well, normally we're not allowed to combine those two together as one object. That's what's known as shatnez. It's a very complicated idea. I'd be happy to tell you more about Jewish clothing regulations. But in this particular case, if that is what is needed, you are allowed to do so. It takes precedence over the normal prohibition. Judaism asks us to recognize that Judaism cannot be simplified into something that is just so cut and dry that we always know precisely what to do just by reading a single sentence. We are always going to have to check and cross-check, discuss, analyze, debate, review, go back, come back again and again and again. There is depth, and it's in that depth that we plant our foundations, because there we find that God has, through the exceptions as well as through the general principles, provided us a stable and firm place from which to grow in our own connection to God and each other. Judaism doesn't expect us, doesn't want us to abandon our own logic, to abandon our own investigatory skills. It wants us to use them in aid of pursuing the details of how to live life properly. And in those little cherubim, those cherubs sitting on top of the ark, in that paradox of their position despite other prohibitions, we are called to service, to recognize that things are a little more complicated than we might have thought. And that's okay. Shabbat Shalom.